Yeah, so
over in
in Edgartown. Yeah. So I came up with her one summer.
Maggie has gotten into two fender benders.
Okay.
She's been on vacation for 3 days. with all these people.
Sorry to keep you all waiting. The logistics of this are always a challenge to get 325 people in this room, but it looks like you're here. You may not be cool, but you're in, so that's the important part. Welcome. I have the great pleasure of officially opening the 7th biannual Martha's Vineyard Book Festival, and welcome. I want to welcome our authors, the moderators, and our guests. The 28 authors have traveled from all over the country to attend. They've come from Alabama, from Atlanta, from Brooklyn, from Maine, from Manhattan, from Nashville, New Brunswick, Princeton, Roanoke, Washington, and also from Boston, West Chop, West Tisbury, Edgartown, and Chilmark. We're thrilled you're here. We know it's not easy to get here sometimes. We want to extend a special welcome to those who it's their first visit to the island. Just like President Obama, we expect you will be back, having come the first time. And a particular welcome to Ashley Parker and Glenn Thrush. You both surely earned a vineyard vacation. Among the authors are professors, deans, comedians, poets, too many Pulitzer Prizes and PhDs to mention, scientists, a medical doctor, chefs, entrepreneurs, film producers, booksellers, White House staffers, newspaper columnists, first-time novelists, and radio hosts. You're all authors, though, and we're so glad you're here. You have helped us understand a year that defies understanding and distracted us when we needed distracting, which was quite often. There are many people to thank for making the festival possible. This year we have an extraordinary group of moderators, interviewers, and introducers. You read, researched, and prepared for the next few days, and you draw out the authors and help them think about their work in new ways. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Book Festival Advisory Panel. These accomplished individuals helped us identify authors and set the themes. Particular thanks go to Dawn Davis, Steve Fisher, who's there, Joan Nathan, Richard Russo, Al Styron, and Pat Sullivan. We have many sponsors who help make the book festival happen. Cape Cod 5-Cent Savings Bank provided an important grant. Mass Center for the Book has been a steadfast supporter. Michelle Haynes and Cape Air support us by bringing in many of the authors. And Michelle Haynes, I think if she's here, Michelle, could you identify yourself? Yay, Michelle. If you took Cape Cod here, you will see that there's a lovely little book festival section in the Bird's Eye View magazine. They've been great supporters. We're delighted to be working with WBUR this year, who's providing some of the moderators for Sunday, Jeremy Hobson, Tom Ashbrook, and Robin Young. A Bunch of Grapes has been our partner from the beginning. In their busy season, they work tirelessly to make this happen. Generous individual donors are vital to making a free event possible, and we couldn't do this without their support. I also want to personally thank those people who've housed authors. It's a tough time to have house guests when you have other things going on, and many of you stepped up and did that. We love you so much. Thank you. There's a few people who've done extraordinary work in facilitating the details of this event, an event with endless details. I want to take a minute to point out and acknowledge my good friend Wendy Wolfson, who has organizing the transportation kills me. She does it. And she never gets angry or frazzled. She's unbelievable. I also want to mention a few other people who've been very helpful. Ginny Morris, Melissa Patterson, who does all our graphic design, Denise and Peter Glassman, all of those people that came in and got the food going, Leslie and Joel. Christine Skidmore from the Chilmar Community Center. They just all did whatever it took to get this ready. A special shout out to family. Some of you have traveled far and quickly to come here and help. Sisters, sisters-in-law, brothers-in-law. So thank you all for making the effort to be here, as well as the DC crew who comes driving up I-95 to make this happen too. We couldn't do it without you and without Eben and Oliver, who both came. We love you. Finally, Jane Seagrave and the staff of the Vineyard Gazette. We worked closely in planning tonight, and it was Jane's vision that has brought you this very special evening. You've also seen the exquisite supplement that they did on the book festival, the work of Julia Wells, who's here, Bill Evell, and their fabulous staff. How lucky are we to live on the Vineyard and have such a fabulous newspaper? Martha's Vineyard is an extraordinary place, not just for its natural beauty, but because of the people who populate it and the work they do. It's a place where we can escape DC and New York City, or wherever we live, rejuvenate and gain a clearer perspective. And that is what tonight and this weekend is about. So here's to a terrific book festival. And I just want to thank also Kate Treitman, who's 8 months pregnant and has done, if you saw our Facebook stuff and our Instagram stuff, that's the woman who's made it happen. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jane Seagrave.
Oops, thank you, Sue Ellen. When we thought about the topic for this panel about 8 weeks ago, we were concerned briefly that it might not be relevant. But that White House keeps delivering. Thank you for coming tonight to hear what I'm sure will be a riveting discussion. Before I introduce our speakers, I just have one thing to say. Thank God for a free press. All right. Please don't take it for granted. I'm delighted to introduce 3 outstanding reporters whose coverage of the Trump White House has been as exceptional as the White House itself, and I mean that as a compliment. Ashley Parker is a White House reporter for the Washington Post, the Amazon Washington Post, which she joined at the beginning of the administration after 11 years at the New York Times. Most of those in the Washington Bureau. You've probably seen her on MSNBC, where she's a senior political analyst also, and she's just back from Eastern Europe with Mike Pence. We're delighted she could join us. Glenn Thrush is a White House reporter for the New York Times, where he can't seem to stay off the front page. I'm told this was not done by Stephen Miller. He's had a shoulder operation. Glenn worked at Newsday, Bloomberg, actually the Daily News I learned briefly, and Politico, where he was chief political correspondent before joining the Times. And like some other people we know, you can almost always count on him to be on Twitter, where at last count he had 312,000 followers. Our moderator for this evening is E.J. Dionne Jr., who's done just about everything in political journalism, and we've been lucky to have him on the island for the last several weeks. E.J. worked at the Times for 14 years. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, writes a twice-weekly column for the Washington Post, and is a regular commentator for NPR, ABC, and MSNBC. And appropriately for this event, he's about to come out with his, I believe, 7th book in September, written with Norman Orenstein and Thomas Mann. It's called One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. Please join me in welcoming Ashley, Glenn, and EJ.
First of all, my co-authors and I thank you for that warm acknowledgement of the book, which is published on September 19th. Just saying, I do want to salute the Vineyard Gazette, which is an extraordinary institution, and we were talking before. It is great to see a successful news organization, and the Vineyard Gazette is one of them. I also want to salute WBUR. I'm only here for a few weeks, but I did make my contribution this week to Cape and Islands Public Radio. I really want to thank the people of Martha's Vineyard. We have had the warmest welcome here. We've been talking about how often people have gone out of their way for us, including today when we were lost and trying to find a trail. And all we had to do is tell the person we agreed completely with her that those bales of hay should not be in front of her house. And then she got us exactly where we needed to go. The people here are just spectacular. And I can tell we're not in Washington anymore listening to those opening comments because people so went out of their way to acknowledge the work that other people did. So this is a wonderful thing. Two people I noticed in the front here that I want to mention. One is Rick Patterson, great novelist and columnist, who was our first welcome here, and we were so grateful. And then I love that Deborah Tannen, whom you have to go hear tomorrow, is here because go ahead, give Deborah a hand. She's awesome. I am hoping now that Deborah will add to her talk a careful analysis of the nature of the conversation between Glenn and Ashley and how that might be related to gender or the institutions they work for. Anyway, love you, Deborah. It's not a very interesting time in politics, so you were all here clearly because you know how great Glenn and Ashley are. And they really are, and I just have to say, when I was asked to do this, I was pleased and excited that I could be with two really great people. And I'm very biased because Glenn worked with my wife 25 years ago.
5 years ago. Yeah.
And Ashley was an editor of the high school newspaper at Walt Whitman High School, where all three of my kids also wrote, including my son who's up front here. And they're both great people. And actually, I don't say this to be flattering. We're really lucky as a Republic, and those of us in the journalism business are really lucky that they're the kind of people who are covering the White House, and I really and truly mean that. And you will see why when I ask my first question, because since I work for the Washington Post, I don't want to show any bias, so I'll go to the New York Times guy first. I cleared this with them both. I wrote to both, and I asked, what do you really want to talk about? And Glenn wrote me a short essay, very short, so I can read the whole thing, that I think is a really useful way to set up our conversation. So I'm going to ask, Ashley wrote a cool thing too, which I will get to, but I want to read what Glenn wrote and just ask him to elaborate. And bear in mind, as you listen to me, as you listen to Glenn, this guy was played on Saturday Night Live, which was very cool. But here's what Glenn wrote. He said, I think in general, I'd like to focus on the danger of succumbing to the theater aspect of covering this White House and trying to do a basic journalism job in an environment where the president and his staff want to drag you on stage for their own benefit. I think there is a kind of narcissism virus Trump has introduced to Washington, even though I'm sure you will tell me, this is when people make me feel really old, even though I'm sure you will tell me it's been here all along. The danger for reporters covering Trump, who is the celebrity, is the tendency to view oneself as a celebrity too. So I guess in general, I think a question about the lines between pop culture and populist politics and the actual competent administration of government would be one that I'd be eager to answer. So consider that the question, Glenn. Thank you very much.
Why do we even need him? Do your job, man.
He's a Patriots fan. I'm glad to hear that.
I am a Jets fan.
It's one place I can say that and be somewhat popular.
Well, no, look, I think it is a central component of President Trump's strategy, and prior to that, the Republican strategy on the Hill. It's really evolved, metastasized to some extent through talk radio, conservative talk radio, that the media is their central enemy, particularly when there is no one has emerged in terms of the Democratic Party to replace Hillary Clinton as a target. Donald Trump, there are a lot of factors that led to his election, but the fundamental thing that we all missed was that we thought American politics was fundamentally positive. I will never forget when I started covering the race, looking at his book cover, A Crippled America, with a scowl on his face like he had just eaten a bad shrimp. And wondering, where did the message of Morning in America that Reagan had portrayed, that politicians had gotten elected on for decades, where had that message gone? What we had missed is his base had taken a very negative turn, and anything that smacked of positivism or optimism was perceived as being false. So what's the flip side of that? The way you win elections is to completely torch your opponent. And I think one of the problems that the Clinton campaign had was that they went along with that. And I think for the last, I'd say, 6 weeks of the campaign, they made it much more about a negative attack on Donald Trump than an assertion of what she necessarily stood for. But getting back to the question, they need us up there. And when you're in the briefing room, the sense is that they want to have a fight every single day. They want you to step outside of your lane. They want you to join them in terms of spouting vitriol and getting personal in terms of the way you respond to them. And more than anything else, they want your fame, celebrity, renown to be derivative of Donald Trump's. And that is a very important thing for us to focus on. Trump is a center of celebrity gravity. And everyone who works for him, with the exception, this is why the new chief of staff is interesting, Kelly, who seems to be his own man, but pretty much everyone who has worked for him in a position of authority in the past is someone who is entirely derivative of him. They're getting fame, they're getting power, and they're getting future fortune.
And so let me go to Ashley on that same question. And what I'd like to do is ask, what is it like for you to be operating in a circumstance where you have the newspaper industry in particular doing extraordinary investigative work on this side, and then an administration that at least up to now has leaked like a sieve on the other side because they now no longer stab each other in the back, they stab each other in the front. What is it like to live in the middle of that? And then what is it like, as we do now in a way journalists didn't do 10, 15 years ago, to go on television and be asked to comment on all this while avoiding the appearance of having a political point of view? Just talk about your day and one of the things and your days and your weeks and how you think this through, and also just about, as you put it, the horrifying duty rotation at the Washington Post, where every day, I guess, someone else is in what is called the hot seat.
Yeah, so I think this is sort of one way that's illustrative of just what covering this administration is like. At the Washington Post, our team is 6 White House reporters. That's the same as at the Times, at the Journal, at Politico. That's pretty standard. And so we have 2 rotations. One is the traditional duty reporter, which always existed, and it's the person who's in the briefing chair every day, the person who's at the White House, the person who, if the president travels with him, the person, news of the day, you're responsible for reaching out for comments, stuff like that. And then we have this other position that seems born entirely to handle what is Donald Trump, and it's called the hot seat. And basically, it's another rotation. It's the worst rotation to have. And basically what happens is when you're in the hot seat, or when I'm in the hot seat, what I do is I set my cell phone alarm for like 6 a.m., 6:15 a.m., 6:30, and 6:45, and my cell phone goes off, and I look to check if Donald Trump has tweeted, and if he hasn't, I roll back over and I sleep until the next alarm goes off, and at some point, often between 6:30 and 6:45, it's like the president is awake and he's tweeting, and what you do is you just or what I do is I just pull my laptop into my bed and I just start filing. And so this hot seat is to just handle the incoming fire hose of news. And so it's really striking to watch. For instance, I remember the week Neil Gorsuch was confirmed to the Supreme Court. I don't even know if it was on the front page because and normally that would be a huge story, above the fold, front page story, but there was just so much other news, right? It's we're confirming a Supreme Court justice, but also we're possibly impeaching the president, and there were so many conflicting things that you just need this other person to catch everything. And so that's one way we handle it at the Post. And then briefly getting back to Glenn's point, in terms of just the way it's the Donald Trump show, the first time I realized that was covering, so I was at the Times during the campaign, and I was one of the few reporters who sort of traveled around the country and went to all of these rallies. And these rallies were they were like a production. They were going to a Broadway show or a concert, and there were certain things that happen at a Donald Trump show. At some point but everybody chants, who's gonna pay for the wall? And everybody knows it's Mexico. And at some point, Hillary Clinton.
We don't hear that as much anymore, by the way. Yeah.
Hillary Clinton's name is invoked, and we all know the refrain is, lock her up, and at some point everybody chants, CNN sucks, and at some point the press, sitting in the middle of a pen, sort of right there in the room, he focuses attention and he trashes either little Katie Tur or Sarah Murray, and this is what a Donald Trump rally is like, and it's just not when I covered sweet Jeb Bush or Mitt Romney. It's just a very different dynamic.
Let me, Glenn, you talked about the sort of narcissism that this creates. That was a heck of a news conference yesterday, where Stephen Miller, there was Stephen Miller, Jim Acosta, and Glenn Thrush. Talk about how that came down and how that moment fits into your analysis here, and what you felt you were doing, and what is your obligation here, because you do have to ask tough questions of this White House, particularly when they say things that aren't true.
Yeah.
And yet, in doing so, you create the very dynamic that you were describing. I'd like you to sort of analyze that using yesterday as a good example, I think.
Let me just, before that, let me piggyback on what Ashley was saying. First of all, Ashley covered the Trump campaign pretty much, not from start to finish, but was there a lot of it. I'm a relative newbie. I've been at the Times for 7 months. I've been covering Trump full-time for 7 months. Before that, I was covering the next president of the United States, Hillary Rodham Clinton. And I was expecting, I don't think there wouldn't have been a hot seat. It would have been sort of a slightly warm seat. I think, well, you go into these press conferences. First of all, the briefing room, for those of you who haven't been there, is very small. It looks much larger on TV than it actually is.
Smaller, much smaller than this room.
Oh, way smaller.
Yeah.
Would you say 5, 6 of them could cram into this room? And the front row has always been the TV guys. And the TV guys, and I mean this, no disrespect to my brethren on the broadcast, but they preen. That's what they get paid to do. They get paid to have the camera on them while they're asking the tough question. And then the answer is sometimes secondary to that, right? I mean, it's just the nature of the game. Most of them are extraordinarily good at what they do and very good at eliciting answers. But print and broadcast have obviously different functions. The thing about these guys, covering these guys, is that they don't even bother giving you false statistics most of the time. When you would go and cover a new policy, and this ranges from the Bush administration, and I also covered City Hall in New York, people would at least have the fig leaf of handing you a fact sheet. We are about to completely radically overhaul X policy, and in order to bolster that, here are 5 studies, and a lot of times they're fakakta studies that are clearly angled towards a certain conclusion. But these guys don't even bother doing that. I remember, I don't know if you remember this, when the president unveiled the outline of his tax policy, it was a It was a single-page, double-spaced handout.
In big type.
No, and here's the best part. They only printed out half enough to hand out to everybody who was in the briefing room. So not only was there nothing on it, but people were fighting each other to get at the nothing. Perfect. I think it's a great metaphor for covering the whole damn thing. But I think Stephen Miller is somebody, a fascinating, one of those fascinating, boring people that Washington produces. He's a former Senate staffer and a real ideologue on immigration, and he believes, and I would use the term believe because it is an article of faith for him, that immigration, both illegal and legal, suppresses wages among working class folks, native-born Americans. There's a lot of evidence to the contrary of that. There's been no firm causal link established, and he was standing up there articulating a policy which is controversial inside the administration of cracking down on legal immigration through various means by which they haven't been very specific. What I was trying to do in that briefing room was, with my relatively limited knowledge of the subject area, get him to give me a number. Tell me how many Americans have lost their jobs, or give me a statistical benchmark on how wages have been reduced because of the policy that you are looking to change. If you're going to try to change something radically, if you're going to change the immigration status of millions of Americans, tell us why you're doing it. And in the course of my asking that question, he delivered a speech, which, by the way, politicians do. And it is my obligation to tell him, no, I don't want to hear your speech. I've heard your speech before 7,000 times. I want you to give me statistical data. And so his role then, and he is very good at this, very good at this. He was an excellent debater at Duke University. That was his training, was to attempt to parse my words and turn me into a debate opponent. What you're watching there is Stephen Miller trying to turn me into a political opponent and me trying to get information out of him. And I think that was why it got sort of contentious. But the one thing I realized halfway through the exchange was it was becoming a little bit too much about me and Steve, and I kind of pulled off at that point, and Jim Acosta took over.
He'd be a good politician if you carefully parse how he just answered that question. Let me ask you, I want to ask something. We will get to the audience, by the way, quite early in this, but there are a few things I want to just sort of lay out for us. Russia and how that is handled inside the White House. There are typically damage containment teams, and this so often looks like the operation of a damage enhancement team. And in particular, how they seem to act guilty even as they insist that they're not, yet they seem to have some strategy about playing to someone out there. And you heard it again last night with Trump's speech in West Virginia, where he's really trying to say that this whole scandal is trying to rob his people of the victory that they had. Can you talk about what it is like in that press room and in the White House dealing with the Russia story, and what it's like also to be in there while our reporters over here are producing all this damaging information?
I mean, I do think the Trump administration is correct that, like, the average voter, and certainly their average voter, does not really care about the Russia investigation. It's just not what animates people if you travel the country and talk to them. But I do think, so I have no, I'm not Bob Mueller, right? Like, I don't actually know if the Trump campaign colluded during the campaign. But I do think what's more damaging than what they may or may not have done are all of the actions they've taken that looks like they're trying to cover it up. And the person who is doing the most, anti-damage containment, as you put it, is the president himself. And so normally you hire lawyers to protect you. And he has hired a legal team who he flouts, he ignores. There was one time we reported his legal team met with him and was basically whatever you do, just don't mention X. And they had literally left the White House and they weren't back at their law offices, and he tweets about X, right? And so he just can't help himself, and I think, and nobody can understand it, or it seems confounding, right? Like, if he really did nothing wrong, why not just let this investigation play out? And I think, and you've spoken about this too, but I think the reason he is so obsessed with this, and now also he's upset because it's getting into his family's finances and his business dealings, and it's pulling in the people he loves, but the reason is, like, he sees the Russia issue as an assault on his legitimacy as the president, and it gets at, like, his key insecurity, which is that, like, he didn't deserve this, that everything he's achieved, you know, he's still not taken seriously. He's the kid from Queens, and even when he makes a lot of money, it's kind of like gauche, and it's not old money, or it's crude money and crass money, and then he finally gets elected to the presidency, and he doesn't win the popular vote, and he thinks, like, people want to take it away from him, and that, I think, is why he is so obsessed and so spun up about Russia and, like, self-damaging.
Glenn, just on that, do you think he seems to have a particular fear of this investigation extending beyond Russia, especially if it goes down a financial road? Do you have a thought on what their thinking is about all of this?
The one thing that, the larger context of this is, I set out to cover American politics, not Donald Trump. The absolute all-encompassing blanket nature of covering this guy that you just dragged into thinking about him all the time. And if you kind of look at for the lowest common denominator of everything that he does or says, it's about focusing attention on himself. And for those of you, if any of you have had, like, kids, for instance, you're familiar with this phenomenon, and it doesn't necessarily put you in the best mood every single day. So I mean, so part of the justification is just the massive id that we are trying to chase every single day. And what was the question?
Just a question about where they fear this is going.
The financial stuff is extremely, we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know if he knows what we don't know. And I think the main thing is, he is basically a salesman. I'm from New York. I have been around Donald Trump my entire life. My in-laws grew up in Trump Village in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. I've been covering him more or less as anyone. I come from New York City tabloids. I mean, before he became a presidential candidate, my last 2 interactions with him, by the way, were not answering phone messages from him when he was hawking his West Side project. That was Donald Trump. He's a real estate salesman. He's a real estate salesman to rich people. He's a real estate salesman to nouveau rich people. So that's all about selling aspiration. So fact and reality, particularly fact and financial reality, are things that he doesn't necessarily want out there. So in addition to sort of the psychic component of this, when you start getting into money with Donald Trump, specific dollar amounts, you are in real trouble. He went to war against Bloomberg, and I think it was the Wall Street Journal, or was it Business Week, during the campaign, when they were downgrading his wealth. People forget that that was one of the big fights that he had initially. And that part of his, I think, lack of disclosure in terms of his income tax returns has not necessarily to do with where the source of his money is, but how much of it he actually has. So in terms of legitimacy, to Ashley's point, this is a man who has defined for most of his life legitimacy by how much money he's made. So this gets to the very core of his legitimacy or illegitimacy.
We just have the seeds today at this table of a new conspiracy. Glenn Thrush grew up in Trump Village, and we all know what that means. So thank you
Technically,
for that.
no. Technically, my parents owned a Carvel ice cream store located a quarter of a mile from Trump Village. Let's be...
That's close enough. We could put something, Rick, you could do a novel on this. I sort of do have, even though I know not everybody in this room is in Chilmark, and not everybody in this room is here year-round, but I do have a sense of the politics of the room. I looked up, just so you know, the vote in Chilmark in 2016 was Clinton Kaine 617, Trump and Pence 94. So we do know where this is coming from, and I think a lot of people have this question, and I think personally it's a legit question, which is the whole question about false balance during this campaign, and how you guys, looking back on how the campaign was covered, everything we're seeing from Donald Trump, really, in some sense, everything except his victory was quite predictable. This is not a different Trump than we saw in the campaign. And I at least think there is a question that we in journalism have to answer. I'm on the opinion side. One set of sins were not like the other, and yet a lot of times this desire for balance forced the coverage to say, well, he does this bad and she does that bad, and therefore it's equivalent. I just heard recently from someone who was talking to a TV person whose job was to find stuff on Clinton so that it could look balanced, and it was a lot harder to find the stuff on her. Can you talk about this whole question of false balance, and what responsibility does the media have, but in particular, because I think the newspapers did a better job on this, and not just because of my own bias, how much responsibility does television have, given all of the free coverage that Donald Trump did? I mean, he's the only guy ever who could do Meet the Press and This Week and Face the Nation in his pajamas. That had not been permitted before. He could do it on the phone. He insists he never did it in his pajamas. So just talk about the campaign, because I think a lot of people, at some point somebody was going to ask about that, and I think it's a fair set of questions. Ashley?
This is slightly different, but like as someone who covered Trump and really didn't have much dealing with the Democrats, like the existentially troubling thing I found was it often just felt like we were in the nothing matters election. And so typically when you cover candidates, you cover politics. If you write that, well, two things. One is Trump and his team would just blatantly lie, right? And it wasn't even the cute Clintonian lying, right? Like depends on what the meaning of the word is. It was just like straight up lies. So that was one thing that I think journalists kind of had to grapple with, that it wasn't just a creative twisting of the facts. It was just fact-free information. But normally if you're covering a candidate and
Fact-free, that's a great phrase, by the way.
But if you're covering a candidate, typically, and you fact-check a candidate, like I'm covering Jeb Bush, and he's saying, Florida was #1 in job creation for 3 years in a row, and you do a story saying like, well, that's not quite true. They were #1 in job creation 1 year, but then Texas surpassed them. You often see a campaign react to that, and the candidate either takes that line out of their speech or they tweak it to be accurate, and it's not because they care about what we, the media, thinks, but because they believe there's a social penalty if the media calls them out for lying or being incorrect or being crude, and they're changing it because they don't want to pay that social penalty with the voters. And what was interesting about Trump, and I'm not saying the coverage was perfect at all, but I would argue some of the coverage was a lot better and tougher, especially once he became a real candidate, than people give us credit for, but it was just that it simply did not matter, right? You could write that Trump said this, or he did that, or he's lying about this, or this is simply not true, and voters just did not care. And again, you're not writing to change voters' minds one way or the other. You're sort of writing to tell the truth as you best know it in that moment. But it was just a striking departure that I have never seen before in covering politics. That he was just sort of like impervious to, facts.
Glenn, I almost want you to go back. Thank you. That was very good. And I want you to go back to your arch opinionated self that used to write those lists of 5 for Politico, and go look back on the campaign and sort of how you, just in light of exactly what Ashley said. And also, just an ancillary question. I've always thought that Trump profited immensely from the thing he always complained about, which is nobody thought he could win.
Oh, yeah.
And the fact that nobody thought he could win meant, among other things, I think, that the investigative work got delayed. It was big. There was a lot of it eventually. And Trump is the only candidate in history who fended off one scandal with another scandal. And it was really remarkable.
Oh, yeah,
but could
yeah.
you I'd like you to take sort of 2, 3 steps, 5 steps back from the campaign, sort of how you've
And then
thought about
fall
it
over.
since.
No.
Yeah, right. No, don't injure anything else.
Look, back to your, well, first of all, this is the first president, I believe, in history who has lied about talking to the head of the Boy Scouts. I got to say, we have novelists out here. That's a new one. Come up with that one, guys. Back to your original question about kind of how we covered the campaign, because I think I can answer that one with that one. The problem is, it doesn't matter how we cover the campaign to some extent, because we now have a cohort of this country that isn't paying attention to what we view as kind of mainstream media, who has been fed an entire line, and we've had 30 years of this, of being channeled towards an essentially propagandistic media on the right. I'm sorry, there's not an equivalence between mainstream media which is consumed, I think, overwhelmingly by progressives, and what's going on the right. We can't play that game anymore. Fox and Friends is not the equivalent of CNN on its very best day, right? Even if, like, Putin hijacked CNN for an afternoon. I think, and that is the fundamental problem. We're talking to people who won't listen. So we are continuing to do our job in the way generally that we have done our job, collect the facts, attempt to hold people accountable, and you have a group of people with Trump and his supporters who are not playing by that same set of rules. They're playing, you know, we're playing baseball and they're playing football. The other thing I think that's sort of important to note is that I think the president has created an environment, and my colleague Maggie Haberman loves this term, gaslighting, based on the Hitchcock film, of creating an essentially alternative reality that they get people to buy into. So you have a group of people, you have, I think it's, 63% of Republican voters believe that the president and his staff had no contact with the Russians at all. People have opinions about fact. Think about that. We are now operating in an environment where we have a large segment of the electorate, the one that got the president elected, who have opinions about whether or not verifiable fact was true. That is an incredibly dangerous situation. So I think that's what's changed the entire game. We're continuing ahead in the Teddy White mold of this is the way, this is the continuum of history. We're just rolling along this river towards a larger progress. We have taken this river has gone over the banks, and we are in an entirely different environment now.
I want to press both of you on this because right at the beginning we started with your point about Trump wanting to make the media part of the narcissistic game. But you really have, you've often had battles between White Houses and journalists, and there have always been White Houses that didn't want certain information out. I don't think we have ever had, or at least not in, I can't think of it till maybe certain points in the early Republic, but that's when all the press was partisan, a real wholesale war by the government, by the administration against the mainstream media, which means how do you avoid the problem of confrontation? Because their policy, their very attitude toward news, toward facts, makes it a confrontation between institutions. How do you guys deal with that? Ashley?
I mean, so I should say this is also the first White House I've ever covered, so I know no different.
Yeah.
But you know, I'm used to like an inherently antagonistic relationship between the people I cover and the media. That's not that different. I mean, the one thing, this is sort of the opposite point, but the one thing that is interesting in terms of their relationship with the media, for as antagonistic as it is, and you know, Sessions just declared war on the media and leaks, and I think we've never seen that before, but in a weird way, this is one of the most open and accessible administrations we've ever covered for a couple of reasons. So one is that when the president tweets, we know exactly what that man is thinking in that moment, right? It's not strategy or like, you know, Chuck Schumer political chess. It's like Donald Trump feels something and he can't contain it any longer and he puts it in a tweet. And so he's the first president we know what he's thinking in real time. He's also, and again, I didn't cover Obama, but I had a good enough sense of it. If you wanted to get an interview with Obama or even get any FaceTime with him, or if Hillary had been president or George W. Bush before that, you would go through their press people and there would be layers of negotiations and interviews and you would come in at an appointed time and there would be press aides sitting in and you would have 15 minutes and they would kick you out after 15 minutes. And this has happened to me. I know this has happened to Glenn. You're in the West Wing for a meeting and someone says like, oh, hey, do you want to like wander into the Oval Office to say hi to the president? And you're kind of like, sure. But that does, to be clear, that does not happen in any other administration.
No.
And then the final thing is this White House, because the president is someone who consumes so much media, especially television media, but also print newspapers, and also print newspapers drive what's on television, so it's all this weird ecosystem. His aides, and maybe this will change under General Kelly, but like they also need us in this weird way. And so all of these factions, instead of, even Ivanka, sometimes when she wants to make a point to her father, like she'll get someone to write a letter to the newspaper. If Bannon wants a point of view across, or Kellyanne, or those factions or whatever, they'll use the newspaper or the TV reporters to get it in front of the president instead of making that pitch in a meeting. So we're often hearing what all of these competing and warring factions are thinking all of the time.
Yeah, it's like a family that's like removed the facade of their house so you can watch them live their lives.
That's a good way of putting it.
Look, he's eating Cheetos. Yeah.
What is the competition like? And I want to go back to something I raised, which is you have two completely different sets of competition now over what's going on inside the White House and coverage of the White House, and then the scandal coverage. And I love the New York Times, Washington Post war. I think it's good for journalism. We have two pugilists here. We're not talking baseball, we're talking demolition derby. No, what is this like? What is that sense of competition? And how do the Trump folks play on that themselves?
Well, Ashley's a detestable person working for a terrible news organization.
Believe me, he should add. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's look, I may be in the decided minority on this, but we've all worked for different places. And I think Trump is actually, this is gonna sound totally self-serving, but I really do honestly mean this. I think Trump has driven us together, and has one of the really, really invigorating aspects of doing the job right now is there's no moral ambiguity when you wake up in the morning. It's like you feel like it's like being a fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain. It's like you may die, but you're gonna get to fire your bullets first, and it's like. So, and again, I am a tremendous fan of the Washington Post. I think Ashley has done some tremendous work. Costa has done some great work. Phil Rucker is terrific. You should read everything that he writes. And the investigative team over there is fantastic. Devlin Barrett and Adam Entus and those guys. And our investigative teams are really good. There's a lot of competition. People are really goading each other. Every afternoon you'll hear everybody cussing the other. Something will pop at 5 o'clock and I'll be like, that story is bull. And then they'll be like, 10 minutes later, well, that story isn't bull. But we just came up with this. So it is a lot of fun being in the newsroom, just like for those of us who work till 3 o'clock in the morning on our school newspapers, which is how we all got into this crazy game. It is just it's an incredibly cool thing. But I think the competition thus far is sort of is bringing out the best. And I think all the stuff. I think the higher you get, let me put it this way: the higher you get up on the masthead, I think the more intense the competition is. I think reporters, we do compete every day with one another, but I think in general we all know we're doing. Did I just make that up, or is that actually true?
Ashley, by the way, I want to open it. I'm going to ask one more question about Kelly, but I think there are mics that are going to go through the room. If we could just get that process begun, or somebody let me know how that's going, so we can start with you guys. But Ashley, the competition, the Celtics, Lakers, Red Sox, Yankees. What's this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it feels invigorating, right? Like it often just feels like a tennis match with like you're just watching the ball go back and forth on Twitter. And we often say like in our newsroom, like it's scoop o'clock, right? And because it means, like.
Is that 5?
It's like 6 p.m. on a Friday when like all you want to do is go home, and like either your competition has some amazing story or your colleagues have some amazing story.
Can I just say, can I throw Politico into, as somebody who worked at Politico 7.5 years, I throw Politico into the.
Yeah, Politico has some great story. And exactly what Glenn said, like that, there was and I think we're all very aware of what everyone in the competition is doing, right? I mean, Mike Schmidt, there was a period, he had a week, he worked for the Times, and he broke a number of those great Comey stories. And I can remember sitting in the Post newsroom and like some story breaks and everyone's like reading it to take it in, and then I hear like, it's Schmidt again, and like everyone goes scrambling. And I assume, they're having those conversations about our reporters at some points too.
Kelly, we've had him for a week. What does this mean? And has he made any change? And does it really matter whether he makes any change? I'd love your assessments of Kelly and the meaning of this.
Well, I think it's interesting that I grew up in kind of ethnic New York. that everyone is focused on Trump hiring generals. I'm just looking at all these Irish guys. As a nervous Jewish kid who went to an Irish high school. Just kidding, I'm a quarter Irish.
No, you weren't, but go ahead.
Look, I think, to me, this strikes me as a collision course. Kelly was offered the job as early as May. He told people that he didn't necessarily want it. For those of you who don't know, he is, the one characteristic, we did a profile of him that published today that talked a bit about this stuff. The one characteristic General Kelly seems not to possess is a terrific sense of humor. And I think, which will serve him well. The less you laugh, the better you are. Look, I think Trump is somebody who likes to have his way. Kelly has told people that he is there to control the staff and not the president, but ultimately that's a contradiction. The president's behavior, as Ashley illustrated very well, is the main problem with this administration. Ultimately, Kelly will have to confront him. What I think is really fascinating over the last couple of days is this chess match going on between Kelly and Jared Kushner. And apparently, I was just reading before we came on the pool report of Trump flying from Washington to his endless summer vacation in Bedminster. They opened up the cabin door just enough so that the reporters could see Kelly sitting with Jared Kushner at a conference table, just laughing and having the best possible time. So.
Do you have a thought on Kelly and what this means?
So I've actually have not done that much reporting on Kelly because I was traveling with Trump, but my general sense, just having watched him during the campaign, is I am deeply skeptical of Trump's capacity to change, right? Like, he's a 71-year-old man. Those habits get entrenched and they just become more so as you get older. And I remember during the campaign, there were all of these moments, some of which I believed myself, where it was like, Trump is suddenly going to become presidential, like, once he gets the nomination, right? And then he would, like, read a speech off of a teleprompter and everyone would go crazy, right? Like, he's so presidential, he can, like, read those words right there. And then he'd, like, derail, and it would be like, okay, well, once he gets to the convention, like, that's when he becomes presidential. And, you know, once he's in the White House, or once he wins the White House, and then it didn't quite happen. And, like, well, once he's inaugurated. And I guess technically, as Kellyanne Conway says, like, he is the president, like, ergo, he is presidential, right? But I don't think that, so I will say, it does seem from the outside, as someone who's just been a reader of this past week of Kelly, it does seem like he has successfully imposed some discipline for like 5 days. I often find that the president is capable of sustaining discipline for a period of up to like 9 days. So you should ask me again next week.
Is 9 days how you counted?
I like the way you brought this. Unlike Stephen Miller, she brings statistics, folks.
Who has the lady over, two folks over on the right? I'll try to distribute them across from left to right.
Great, thank you very much. I'm interested in the whole issue about distraction and the shiny object. And MSNBC this morning talked a lot about the release of the transcripts from the conversations with the Mexican and Australian Prime Minister, and suggesting that that was a deliberate leak by the White House in order to call attention away from what's happening with the grand jury. So I'm just curious about, in dealing with the shiny object issues, are those editorial decisions, are those reporter decisions? How do you react to them?
By the way, I want to say that's a great question, and my favorite Twitter response ever, I've forgotten who did it, was someone who sent a tweet that read something like, how are we going to deal with a story that is a distraction from the distraction from the distraction from the distraction? And I do think it's a very hard to figure out what is distraction and what is not, but please, I mean, do you agree with that theory that that's why they put out actually quite embarrassing transcripts or not? And how do you deal with the shiny object issue, both of you?
So I will say, initially, I do think during the campaign, I had a thought of, you know, sometimes it seemed like when something was going awry, the president would tweet out something that was so much more extreme or so much more scandalous that everyone would go over there. I've now sort of dropped that. Like, I think some of these tweets or some of these, the next scandal or the transcripts coming out or whatever it is, they certainly do serve as a distraction or a new diversion to cover. But at this point, I don't think it's intentional. I don't think there's like any strategy behind it. And often the thing that they're using to distract you from is so much worse than the original thing.
It'd be like the president distracting you from Neil Gorsuch by bringing up Russia, right? And no, or Trump or Obama wiretapping. I think they're not that organized, and I think the one thing they are is they're terrifically reactive. So they will see something that occurred yesterday with the leak of those transcripts and then pivot today to attacking the media. So it is much less about them planning this stuff out than having really fast and oftentimes very effective reactions to these events.
The lady right behind her over there, yeah.
Hi.
Do we have a mic? Oh, good, we'll go on this side next. Go ahead.
I just want to firstly, as a mother, as an American, as a teacher, to thank you for being on the front lines and for helping us through this very awful time. You've all been godsends. But my question too is anything going to substantively change after Sessions' pronouncements today in terms of sources, leakers, uncovering the truth? Will it change anything in terms of your ability to suss out what is true, what is not, fact from fiction?
Thank you. Yeah, what is this going to do?
What reporter wouldn't want to go to jail right now? I mean, like, that's like, you want to talk about competition? Go for it. It's like you want to start throwing. I mean, if we're gonna go down this road, I should not do that. What I meant to say was, I just think it's nonsense. I think Attorney General Sessions. We've seen people attempt to do this before in the past. But it is an extraordinarily dangerous. It's an extraordinarily dangerous approach, and he's got a large percent of the population that'll back him on it. So.
Yeah, I think it certainly has a chilling effect. I don't think it stops any journalists from trying to do their jobs. And I should be clear, like, I'm not part of the post-investigative team, right? I do, like, palace intrigue, but so I'm not one of those people. But I think it makes them double down. But people are very worried, and I know at the Post, like, especially those investigative reporters, are taking steps to be very careful, to be protecting their sources, to be protecting information. I mean, even just the Washington Post White House team, not the investigative team, we now conduct a lot of our conversations on an encrypted chat messaging app, which like seems absurd because it often just devolves into like emojis, which probably could be hacked by the Russians and nothing would be given away. But newsrooms are, I think, grappling with, and I don't know specifically what the Times is doing, but with
we all
protecting sources.
We all do the same thing in terms of source protection. But I think the other thing we have to say here is it was the Obama administration with Eric Holder as Attorney General that authorized surveillance of or data collection of reporters. So this isn't something that is limited exclusively to the Trump administration.
Sir.
Thank you. Great panel. Many years ago, I saw the movie All the President's Men when I was a young fella, and Deep Throat was most intriguing in terms of the relationships and how important relationships are, and you mentioned leaking. And I'm wondering, in sources, with respect to that, because of this administration, and let's say a lot of people who work in the White House, it seems that there has been more people who work for the president who are willing to share certain things through your relationships with media. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you. That was, in fact, a question I was hoping to ask, so I really appreciate your asking that. Well, the motivations, what is going on here inside the White House? And you can give away all your sources here, and no one will say a word to anyone outside this room. Go ahead.
Well, when you're a reporter, I mean, the main thing you want to do is get between the staffer and their boss, right? That's your goal. It's like to create a psychological dynamic in which they're giving you information that they should not be giving you, right? For whatever reason, and you use whatever means that you can to do that. This place comes preloaded with that motivation. And And the reason really, it emanates from Trump himself. Trump is a guy who is about Trump, and you know it because everything he's associated with has the word Trump on it. That filters down. So everything Sean Spicer is now associated with has the word Spicer on it. Each person is emulating the boss, so they're branding themselves. So when you go into an environment where each individual player has a dual loyalty to their boss, and it's so funny Trump talks about loyalty because he gives so little, that they realize that it is about protecting themselves. And I would say the motivation for the vast majority of stuff that's leaked, and I'm not talking about intelligence agencies or the deep state, I'm talking about West Wing folks, the kind of stories that we write about. The motivation is often brand protection, attacking one of their enemies internally. And that's the reason why we're able to write these stories, is because it's factionalized and everyone's out for themselves.
Yeah, and it gets back to what I mentioned earlier. A lot of people realize the best way to make their case to the president is not in a meeting, is not in a private situation, it's through the media, so we benefit a lot from that. And, you know, for instance, even just look at the sort of firing of Reince Priebus. In theory, if the president and his family are unhappy with the chief of staff, they could actually just fire him. They had that power. But here's what they did. They brought in Anthony Scaramucci, who was described to me by someone as a kamikaze fighter, who came in and gave a crazy interview to the New Yorker that was so offensive that Reince Priebus had no choice but to tender his resignation, right? And so that just gives you a sense of how this White House works. Instead of the president and his family just firing him, which is fairly simple, you know, they bring in this other person, they create all of these other nightmares, and then once Anthony Scaramucci has fulfilled his role, they're like, all right, your 10 days are up, mission accomplished, you're out.
What was that like when the mooch showed up? What were you thinking? What were you looking forward to? Andy Borowitz said that comedians are bringing a lawsuit against the White House for firing the mooch. What was that like? What went through your heads when this was going on? Ashley, you brought him. I'm glad you brought him up.
I think we both knew him just from covering Republican politics. He's just a colorful character, right? And so I was just excited for someone else who would sort of fit right in.
I was looking forward to his steely competence being employed in the West Wing. You said kamikaze. Someone else described him as a suicide bomber. I just think the funny thing about it is a lot of people outside of the Trump, of the folks in the White House, were telling me for months that Scaramucci was going to be the savior, that he was going to come in for real. Scaramucci was a guy who'd had hedge fund experience, the president likes him, and that he is going to really stop the leaks and get people on message. He got people on message. That's clear. But I think I think what's really interesting and what it illustrates is Trump doesn't know that many people. So you keep hearing the same names over and over again. So when it was one of the interesting things about Kelly being picked. Kelly is part of a group of 5 or 6 people who are the grown-ups in that administration. So his pool of talent that he's choosing from, which is getting smaller and smaller, is ever shrinking. And the mooch came and the mooch went.
Could I ask one quick question, Ashley? How did Priebus survive so long? Is another way to put it. I mean, this was an astonishingly bad fit, and can I just toss that at you?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, Priebus made just a personal goal that his goal was not to advance Republican healthcare legislation, and his goal was not to make the president look good. At the end of the day, at some point, there was a turning point, I believe, where his goal was just to last a year, or just to be the last man standing. And I will say, Glenn was mentioning all of these competing factions, and this is a stunning White House where every single, not principal, but every single aide has their own PR team and their own chief of staff. And so Priebus, what was striking and what the president eventually picked up on and was not particularly happy about was you could write something really negative about the president and maybe you'd get a phone call, maybe you wouldn't. If you wrote something negative about Reince Priebus, his PR team would go into overdrive and you would have 7 people calling you and screaming at you. And so you basically had a full army of RNC staffers devoted to Reince Priebus press, which helped him for a while and then hurt him.
And he had an endless threshold for humiliation at the hands of the president.
That's true.
He just simply, for real, this could have gone on and on and on and on. Him being humiliated over and over by people in the building was not any major motivation for him getting out. It had to be brought into the public before he was driven out.
The lady over there, right there.
Hi, you guys probably know who this was, but somebody said recently there are a bunch of people in the White House who are trying to save America from Trump. Does this sound familiar? I mean, somebody like Kelly and so I'm sort of wondering, are there people in the White House who really understand how insane Trump is and that they need to save America from Trump, or are they all as crazy as he is?
Well,
Do they all want to, do you know what I mean? I mean,
I'm going to do these guys a huge favor by saying, we don't accept the premise of your question.
All right, sorry. But no, I mean, this was something I saw in the news. I mean, the more serious question is, are there people who work for him who understand that there's something very dark and weird and dangerous going on, who are trying to save us from him? Or are they all on the same team?
I will say there were a number of people, I think, who were able to sort of, more establishment Republican types, RNC types, who were able to sort of talk themselves into taking jobs in the administration by using the justification of being like, look, Trump would not have been my first choice, my second choice, or even my 14th choice, right? But he's the president now, and I want to get in. He's a Republican president. We have a Republican Congress. I want to get in there to help pass Republican health care, help do Republican tax reform, and help do these things. And he may be an imperfect messenger and not who I would have chosen, but that's what I want to do. And you do have a lot of sort of traditional Republican types in that administration, and you have some true believers. It's a mix.
Yeah, I think you have, well, first of all, you have the Gary Cohn, Dina Powell cluster, which is predicated, I think, on a much more mainstream view of Republicanism, even though Cohen's a Democrat. Look, the White House is really powerful still. We haven't devalued this to the point where it's not an incredibly powerful institution, and people who want to get things done still head to the White House. The other thing that I would say that I think folks should keep their eye on is this. Where Trump's interests align with the Koch brothers wing of the party, the deregulatory wing of the party, that is where stuff is getting done. Because that is the schism that most hurts Trump. And it's interesting that probably the most effective White House aide whose name you don't know, Mark Short, his legislative director, is a former Koch brothers staffer.
And so does that mean that the Republicans stay on side for a good long time? Because the last week, you've seen a little bit more of a kind of breakup of Republican solidarity. I mean, it seems once they went after a former Republican senator, i.e. Jeff Sessions, somehow or other that was the end of the line, not insulting McCain or any of the other stuff, but something seems to have happened, and yet I'm glad you underscored that, because there is a lot more policy overlap between Trump and very traditional Republicanism than his rhetoric suggests and he wants to let on. Where does the break come? You.
I do think one fundamental problem is there was this sense that the reason Trump would be able to get stuff done, get deals done, is because either people really liked him and wanted to help him, or because these members feared his Twitter feed or feared the wrath of the president. And I think to some extent that's true in some of these House districts, and that's why you're not seeing a ton of profiles encouraged. But I also think if you look in Congress, and you especially look on the Senate side, these people don't respect him and they don't fear him. And again, nobody is going to vote for a health care bill that they think is bad just because they do or don't like the president. But I do think it has made it a lot harder for him to exercise the levers of power and the levers of the presidency when people don't care if he says something negative or his Secretary of the Interior calls you up and threatens your state, right? They just don't care, and they're going to do what they think is right for their constituents.
Yeah, the Senate's a big problem for him. The House is easier. Look, the bottom line is Donald Trump represents the primal, the primal issues of the Republican base better than any politician in America. Donald Trump is really the national politician, the only national Republican politician who's been able to sort of capitalize on that Tea Party energy. So the truth of the matter is, regardless of what he does, he still owns that real estate, and there's nothing that any of these senators can do about that.
Funny you use the real estate metaphor. Can we get some mics into the middle is being discriminated against, as often is the case here. So let's get a couple. Why don't you pass it? Well, let's get two questions at once because this is a crowd that wants. So why don't you pass it right back to you? I'll get to you next time. Go ahead. Speak into the mic or turn. Yeah. Underneath, or just speak really loud.
Mueller does his work, he has some action that is adverse to Trump and his family. What do you expect to be the response from Trump, and what do you expect to be the response from Congress?
All right, hold on. And then the lady right, yeah, right.
I don't know. Oh, yeah, it is working. I assume that, and I hope that most reporters use reliable sources, and you've mentioned trying to make sure your sources are reliable. So what I don't understand is if all these briefings are full of lies and non-facts, why do you keep going to the briefings? Is it inconceivable to just ignore them and not show up?
Two completely diverse questions. I'll let Ashley take the one she wants and stick you with the other one, Glenn. Go ahead.
I'll take the second one.
I wanted to take the second one.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and people have sort of floated the idea of why don't reporters boycott these briefings. I mean, I think, here's the thing, I think you have very few chances to ask the administration the questions you want to ask them, and I still think there's value in showing up and being able to ask your questions, and if they lie to you or they don't provide statistics or they offer spin, like I think that's useful information for us to have in terms of understanding this White House. I'm never going to turn down FaceTime with a member of the administration where I have a chance to ask a question and get it answered. I will say we are under no obligation to use that information to quote it in our stories, and I think if you look in our stories, we very rarely do sort of just quote something that's spin or not true, or if we do, we provide the relevant context. But I just think there's value in being able to ask the administration questions.
Why would we abandon the arena just because the fight has begun? I mean, like, I'm not walking away from a fight. We got to be in there and representing this stuff. It's not just a matter of us, like, asking questions and trying to elicit answers. It's about us telling these people who are lying to us every single day, we're not going away. You can keep lying, but we're coming back every day.
Mueller?
Who knows?
Do you see any endgame strategy that they have? I mean, in other words, what it appears is that he may have been closer to thinking about firing Mueller a couple of weeks ago than he is now. Or so, again, it's just reading tea leaves, but you are there closer.
Well, the Senate is going to, this is one, I have to say, this actually does seem to be, as Ashley was saying before, the number of times that we've predicted the Republicans were going to draw a line with Trump is just, it's endless. So you can't really predict, but it really does seem the Mueller thing. Lindsey Graham was thinking about introducing some sort of a symbolic piece of legislation on that. But you go after Mueller and you start evoking these images of the Saturday Night Massacre with Nixon, I think you're headed into trouble.
Yeah, there are now two bills to try to protect Mueller. This lady here was very patient, and then the gentleman in front of her. I'm sorry. Is the mic way in the back? Can I be go ahead. I want to save you from steps. I should have gone with you in the back there, sir, but.
What was the first question?
Mueller, yeah.
What, Mueller? I thought I got them both. The Mueller and the press room. Yeah, we did. Well, the answer to the question is nobody fully knows, so we were just sort of trying to guess. Go ahead.
Yeah,
There we
okay.
go. Thank you.
Going back to the P word mentioned a few times, policy. You talked about how, you have the teams of 6 and 6 and so on. Could you talk a little bit about handoffs to the people who are attempting to cover non-policy policy in the departments and in the administration, and the issues like health, immigration, tax, and how hard that is to do when the policies are non-existent in most cases, or most of the coverage is focusing on the conflicts in Capitol Hill, conflicts with the White House. So just a little shout out for policy and how you try to work on it through both newspapers.
Amen for that question. And let me, if I can put a point on it, which is there is so much. We have, the two papers have 6 people in the White House. And as you were saying, this is all Trump, 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 Trump personality, Trump, Trump, Trump. Is something getting lost in journalism in what we're supposed to be doing in all of this? What's your reading of where real coverage of policy and how this affects things? You did see some substantive coverage on healthcare,
Right.
I think, and
Right.
that debate brought out a lot of that. But I'm just curious, what?
I actually think some of the policy, at the Post, for instance, not only do we have a White House team, but we have reporters who are devoted to every single agency and are still doing those jobs sort of every single day, and producing stories that may not always get as much attention, but are doing that. I mean, one thing, some of the policy is hard to cover in the sense that it doesn't exist, right? Like, it's hard to write about what the administration is doing on the debt ceiling or what it's doing on tax reform when they don't know. But I will say, Glenn mentioned before that where the administration is actually getting a lot of stuff done is on the regulatory front in deregulation, and I actually think that's some of the best reporting. There's Coral Davenport at the New York Times, who covers energy and environmental policy, and especially something, like a lot of the policy is active. What are they going to do on healthcare? And you can cover it when they finally figure that out, right? But this is stuff that's sort of happening behind the scenes and going away. And I think there's real value when you have a reporter who explains, this thing was quietly signed, but here's what it actually means for national land or for energy. And I think that reporting is happening.
Yep, totally agree. And totally agree about Coral, by the way, who is spectacular.
Yes,
And doing this, by the way, while being 8 months pregnant. Look, I think 2 things. First of all, the policy isn't being generated in the White House because they don't have policy people. The Obama West Wing was lousy with policy people. I mean, you couldn't get them to shut up about specifics, right? My joke about this White House is lots of generals, few specifics. So it's like, so I think what you have to realize is the president is again, it all emanates from Trump. He's not that interested in policy. So much of this stuff is being completely outsourced. On the healthcare debate, he was totally sidelined. He does not have the capacity to really have a discussion when he's sitting around with these senators, apart from to exhort them or yell at them or make jokes. And that's a real problem. When people realize the president doesn't have a grasp of the policy themselves, they'll take that onto themselves. The other thing is, I wrote a story recently about the president's infrastructure plan, which really is one of those rare opportunities where he had a chance to build a bipartisan coalition. There's a lot of will on the Democratic side. And what I discovered, I think it was fascinating to really look at, is that this was one case where Gary Cohn's team had really done their due diligence, but they are sitting on their hands, reluctant to make any kind of proposal or even come up with a legislative strategy or even a timetable because of all this other stuff that they have to deal with, because of the Russia investigation. The political dynamic is so unpredictable, and Trump's attention span is so short, they can't get him to focus on this stuff. So even in areas where the White House has a functional policy shop, and they do on infrastructure, they can't get anything done because the politics are too crazy.
Let me take one up front here. By the way, there's a brilliant Wall Street Journal reporter here. Does he care to join us, or he could pass if he wants? Thank you. And then let's get a mic to this gentleman, because he's. Where? Oh, okay. Well, let you go, and then this man has been waving for a long time. All right, let's get it. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
All right, I just was wondering if I could get both Ashley and Glenn to hone in a little bit more on what they perceive as the dangers. I don't think it's any accident that Glenn left us with this image that he wakes up to, which is being a fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain. And we know what that fight was about, so let's put it in not inconceivable terms. I mean, is there a totalitarian streak in the presidency that you fear, an authoritarian streak? I mean, what is, if you would, both, tell us the you know, at some point, you put all of these dots together and you began to feel some real danger. What is that danger?
I'm going to cheat here. We have a whole chapter in our book on that very question because I think it's a really important question. Let me get that gentleman in, and then you can answer both of them.
Great, thank you. First of all, kudos to you guys for seeking truth from someone who's a pathological liar. Hard job, well done. My question goes to the role of the media in legitimizing this president. I don't know if these facts are correct, but I've been told of 100% of registered voters, only 50% voted, and the 50 that did not vote went to 25 for Hillary and 25 for Trump. So hypothetically, 75% of registered voters did not vote for this guy. What can the media do to put his position in context? I understand he won. I understand there's a large population between the two coasts that do support this guy. But if in fact that's 25% of registered voters, how does the media put that in context?
I'll keep it brief, which I have trouble doing, as you can tell. The question about the fighter pilot analogy, I want to make something very clear. I'm not saying they are our enemy in the conventional war sense. I'm not buying into Steve Bannon's spurious claim that we are the opposition press. I'm not playing that game. What I'm saying is, in terms of us fighting, it's about fighting for our institutional prerogatives as opposed to fighting any particular politician. I just want to make that very, very clear. He clearly has an affinity for authoritarian leaders around the world. It is interesting, the ones that he praises and the ones that he doesn't. I don't need to go through the litany, of facts on that. But one thing I would say is, you're talking about legitimizing him. The voters of Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania legitimized this president. As far as I can tell, there was no large-scale manipulation of actual voting. And I know the Clinton people really well. I was talking to them hourly during the last couple of weeks of the campaign. They knew that something was going on, and they were not able to counter it. And if people didn't get out to vote on that side of the ball, I think it's on the Democrats.
No, but that may well, I believe that to be the case, but let me just, Ashley, take both of those questions, authoritarian, autocratic, that threat, and what role, in other words, I think it's easy enough to say the Democrats screwed up in not figuring out how to avoid that danger. Nonetheless, WikiLeaks, for example, got covered differently in France than it got covered here, those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
Let me just throw that.
I mean, I think to your question in the back, very briefly, I mean, Donald Trump is the president of the United States, and we cover him like he's the president of the United States, and it's just that simple for me. And there's plenty of elections where not that many people show up to vote. I think everyone should show up to vote, but that's their choice, and he's the president. To your question, I think, to me, like, the most troubling thing is sort of just like the crumbling trust in democratic institutions, where we sort of now live in a reality where people can just like choose their version of the facts, whether it's the media or the courts or whatever it is. And I don't think that's the president's fault. I think he certainly plays on that, but I think in some ways Trump was able to become president because people didn't trust the media and people didn't trust these institutions. And one good example I heard of this was Charlie Sykes. He's a conservative radio host in Wisconsin. And he was beside himself in the primary when it looked like Donald Trump was going to win the Wisconsin primary. And he sort of said, he had like a moment of introspection. He said, look, we in the conservative media have spent years delegitimizing the mainstream media, and so now when we suddenly want the mainstream media to fact check the president and hold him accountable, we've trained our voters not to care.
Thank you. We got two questions to this gentleman and that gentleman. I'm sorry for everybody else who couldn't get in. Sir.
Thank you. Yeah, my question actually relates to the last point you made. I think that candidate Trump actually got off very easy during the debates. And perhaps that was because no one thought he could actually win, but he hardly sustained secondary and tertiary questions. And I think that if he's able to survive this term and gets to this 2020 election, I can't imagine, and given what we know now about everything that's happened and potentially the lack of accomplishments, I can't imagine him squirming out of the debates, but maybe I'm being too optimistic. And I wonder if there's any role that print journalists have in really, causing a little bit more severe requirements in terms of vetting during those debates.
Thank you, and sir, right there. Who was, yeah, there we go.
The gorilla in the room. Ashley, you just returned from Pence's offshore.
Oh.
True?
Yeah.
Yeah. What we miss, it seems, since there's so much Trump haze, is how this looks offshore. Because I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning listening to BBC trying to get a perspective. How does this affect us offshore? And particularly, the drumbeat of we haven't had an incident so far, and God help us if we have one, onshore or offshore, with, say, North Korea launching an ICBM that's capable of getting this far. How does that look when you're offshore, say with Pence? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I think our allies are quite worried. That's a lot of what Pence's trips abroad are reassuring allies that whatever, we support Article 5 of NATO, or we will be with them, against Russian aggression in the region. And it's a really strong and forceful message. The only problem is the president back home is tweeting and saying the exact opposite. And so I think these countries that they're most optimistic want to believe what the vice president is saying, but they're nervous. And one funny thing just about these countries in general is nobody knows what to make of this. And so I'm sure Glenn has had the same thing, but I've had a number of diplomats email me and my colleague Phil Rucker and say, these embassies, can you get breakfast? And it's like, of course, like what great documents do you have to slip to us? And we show up for breakfast or coffee and these people are like, so what did it mean when Trump tweeted that about Mika's face, right? And they're literally getting frantic phone calls from their leaders and their people back in their country, and they just don't know what to make of it. And it's like, can you be a Trump whisperer? Can you tell us what to tell?
That's right.
So I think there's a lot of confusion, and they are sort of struggling to make sense of this election the way other people are.
Yeah, they were cornering. I was at the G20 last month. They literally, I couldn't get out of a room. I was being cornered by German reporters asking me what the hell Trump was about.
Yeah.
So,
do you want to take the debate one?
What was the debate one? I don't know. I thought Trump lost all the debates pretty convincingly, particularly the last one. I thought he was. I think the thing we gotta understand is the people who are watching. A lot of people who are watching those debates are not watching the way you're watching a debate. It's just that simple. They're not scoring it. It's a different scorecard. I mean, the one thing I would say that the dynamic that has changed is Donald Trump would not have gotten elected had he not been able to hold his own with independents. It was clear. We have seen in the polling, while his support has maintained relatively steady with his base, although we've seen some erosion lately, his support among independents has collapsed. So that is a dynamic, to me, that is the most dangerous dynamic for him. But in terms of the debate, I think this is the thing that people, I think, have got to understand. You can present, and Ashley's made this point over and over and over again, also in her coverage, is you can fact check him, by the way, I'm a big fan. The one thing I would like to see done in debates is real-time Chiron fact checking.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's going to get done, but I think that would be immensely helpful to people. But even if you have that, I think there's a large percent of people who are not watching the debates for the things that you're watching. Arguably, the most important thing that happened during the debates, not arguably, was that I thought it was the low point of the entire campaign. I was so depressed. Right before the St. Louis debate, when Trump and Steve Bannon staged this Facebook Live event with the 6 women, came right out after the Access Hollywood thing. I said, we're plumbing a depth I've never seen before, and no one's going to go for this. And what do Trump campaign people tell you? That was the turning point of the campaign.
And on that, I'm going to try to end on an uplifting note. So I have a favorite, one of my favorite Václav Havel quotes. He said, "When a truth is not given complete freedom, freedom is not complete." And the search for truth is difficult. The media sometimes have trouble finding it or even seeing it. But I want to thank Glenn and Ashley and all our colleagues who are trying to help us find it. And I thank all of you for your support. Thank you.
Thank you, EJ, and thank you, Ashley and Glenn. That was a great, great panel. We have a reception outside, wine and cheese, for those who can stay for a few minutes. Also, if you didn't get enough tonight, and many of us didn't, we've added a session on Sunday morning, and we'll have a couple of additional reporters there. Mike Bender from the Wall Street Journal. Richard North Patterson's going to join us. Mark Leibovich from the New York Times Magazine. I believe all three of these panelists will be there, and Jeremy Hobson from Here and Now will be the moderator. So hope you can join us. That's 8:30 in the Menemsha tent out here Sunday morning. Coffee, donuts, a $20 donation is requested. And thanks so much for coming tonight.